great to have
All
you
right.
back. So people are watching this now. It's going to be 2022 because I think this is airing January 5th. So welcome to the new year.
Yeah, welcome to the new year for you as well, man. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. And a couple of things I wanted to talk to you about. We've got a new product that's coming out with you in 5 days, which is the first firearm product that anybody that we've ever really had anything to do with it, SBG. So I'm pretty excited about that. I want to talk about that. You've got the sequel to your MDoc series, which came out, I think, last year. Uh,
hmm
and so we'll talk about that. And then the other thing I happened to notice a few weeks ago was that you and I did a podcast last year where we talked specifically, mostly about, wound up talking about the Ahmaud Arbery case.
Yeah.
And that got, I think, 195,000 views and almost 2,000 comments.
Oh, wow.
I can't say I read all the comments, but I scrolled through them for about 30 minutes. And the thing that surprised me was that the vast majority were really positive because I was anticipating the worst.
Yeah, for sure.
And I was legitimately surprised at how positive the comments were. And it made me think a couple things. One, I think people are starving for honest conversation on that topic because for the last couple of years, and my words, not yours, but after January 2020, I think there was a hysteria that swept through the nation and people just got scared to talk about it at all.
Yeah.
So anytime anybody has an honest conversation about it, I think people appreciate that. And I also think that it was a good reminder that people shouldn't be scared to have an honest conversation about it because you're always going to have a crazy minority that's awful and super vocal. But I think people sometimes forget that they're actually a really tiny minority of people.
Yeah. That's the thing. It's like the extreme of either end of it are always the loudest. And but they're the smallest percentage, like they are the minority. The majority of the folks are somewhere in the middle trying to figure it out and honestly trying to figure it out. Like they're legit, like they have their concerns. We all have our biases and they have all that stuff, but they're also trying to work through it and come to some sort of understanding. It doesn't mean they're going to agree or be 100% behind whatever occurred, but they're at least trying to understand it. And they're at least honest about that. They're willing to say, I really wasn't too sure what I thought about this.
Right.
And it's like, cool, man, let's talk.
That you can't even talk about,
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the thing.
I thought a good way to start the new year is we can talk about a little bit more about some of the cases that came up in 2021. There were some big ones, in particular the Rittenhouse case. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about your series coming up, and then I got a few questions that people asked. I want to make sure I get through the questions because sometimes I forget towards the end of the podcast and we never get to them. So first thing is, talk to me about your dry fire series. Why a dry fire series and what is that about?
So the dry fire series, because dry fire is probably the most important thing you'll do for your firearms training. You can go live, but it's kind of like what we talk about white belt on white belt murder, where you have two guys who don't really know what they're doing and you just turn them loose. You drill a little bit, do a few drills, and then go. And then we scratch our head and wonder why they're not understanding jiu-jitsu and they're just headlocking each other and all this other stuff. And so having that period of time where it's a drill intensive, technique intensive, skill building period of time is essential so that down the road they can actually enjoy this stuff and go fast and do all the cool things they see. And it's the same with firearms. You have to have that period of dry fire. You have to have that period where it's just skill building and you just groove in good motor patterns or good movement patterns. You build that mind to muscle connection, whatever we want to call it, and you ingrain really good, safe gun handling habits. And so the best place to do that is dry fire, where the penalty for making a mistake is zero. There's no penalty. So it was really beat into my head early in the police academy, the importance for dry fire. And then a number of the guys that I've trained with over the years, mentors in the firearms world, were always really big on dry fire and how important that is and how you just, unlike other activities that we do, you can learn so much through just dry fire with that, no live ammo anywhere in the room, just working through the mechanics of mounting the rifle or the pistol and driving it into the target and pressing the trigger cleanly and just making a good habit, building a good habit. And so I thought for our first one, we should do something on dry fire. And also, with ammo prices being what they are now, it's probably best to find ways to train without having to spend a couple grand just to go to the range.
Yeah, for sure. That's actually a really good analogy I haven't thought of before, but sending someone who hasn't spent much time with a firearm yet out to the range and just having them fire live rounds without all that training first really is kind of like having two brand new white belts just roll without doing jiu-jitsu first.
Yeah.
I almost wonder if you wind up creating bad habits. In jiu-jitsu, we know that creates bad habits, which is why we don't do it at the gym. We make them go through a process and then we put them into that. And I wonder if it would almost be the same thing with firearms. You actually make your learning curve longer when you do it that way.
You absolutely do. We find when students would come into classes and they would tell us their background, they would consider themselves to be intermediate level shooter or something of that sort. And then we get them down on the range and just see some bad habits. And it's like, man, we have to basically dismantle them and rebuild them because they just got bad habits. You see them, they're doing their mag change, their fingers on the trigger. They're not monitoring the muzzle direction correctly. They're just flagging people and all kinds of just bad habits. You can look at their gear and see how their gear is set up and tell that they've got some bad habits and nobody's ever corrected them. Nobody's ever set them up from the beginning to be successful.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we start looking at that, it's like, man, they really need a dry fire practice to begin with. They really need something in the beginning that sets them on the right path so that when it's time to go live, safety is not an issue. The weapons handling is not an issue. And if you give them commands, they know exactly what to do.
Mm-hmm.
And also what it does too is kind of their programming is better because when you give them an exercise to conquer, they don't really have to think about the gun handling portion of it. They just think about how do I get from point A to point B and accomplish that goal. And so because the gun handling is all just built in now, they don't have to think about how do I mount the pistol or mount the rifle and how do I find the dot or how do I get the sights aligned. All that's done through dry fire. So now we just give them a challenge, something to negotiate, some sort of like move from, the driver's side of the car to the front passenger side of the car, make a few hits on this target, now move back to the passenger side of the car and apply a training tourniquet to this medical dummy. Just a simple task like that. If you have somebody come in that doesn't have a baseline of skill, say like a two-stripe white belt level of skill with the firearm, you bring them into that, you're going to have all kinds of things go wrong.
Yeah.
There's just all kinds of stuff goes bad, and then you have to just start over. So having that dry fire component in place where they've ingrained all the good habits, learned how to do everything properly, it just makes it so much easier, and they progress so much faster.
For sure. I had an opportunity to work with Ray, I think about a year ago, and I just one-on-one for the weekend shooting with him, which was awesome for me. But I've also got a chance to work with you and Andy Stump out in Montana. And every time I work with coaches that know what they're doing, it reminds me, it brings me back to what we've always talked about in SBG, because it's exactly the same thing. It's fundamentals. There's no advanced technique. It's just fundamentals. Whether Andy talking about the highest level stuff that they do, it's always those same fundamentals, grip and trigger pull and sight alignment, and everybody has a slightly different way to do it, but all of you guys constantly go back to those core fundamentals. And it seems so obvious that transcends all of fighting, whether we're talking about with tools or without tools, or the principles that we use for jiu-jitsu are really identical. Even the base and posture and connection piece seems to fit perfectly with what you're doing with handguns.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely you have to have that good base and then build posture out of that. And then the connection is yourself to whatever it is you're driving.
The tool, yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. So, and then MDoc 2, what do we put in MDoc 2 for people that got MDoc 1 who don't know what it is?
So MDoc 2 is just basically we're building off of the skills we had in the MDoc 1. And this is more geared towards people who are combat sport athletes who can then apply different things that for someone who doesn't train, it's easier just to teach them a helmet. It's easier just to teach them to crash into somebody. But for somebody who trains, teaching them a form of a long cover that then allows them to access tools and weapons and those various challenges, it's just basically it's taken even more of their sport skill and applying it to the street, transferring it over to the street. So in MDoc 1, obviously we're going to be heavily weighted towards the stuff we do in sport and making that, just showing people how it just transitions with few modifications to a self-defense scenario. With MDoc 2, we take the more advanced stuff of the sports side of the house. So somebody who's at a blue belt level or higher, things that they can do, now we show them it's the same stuff. It's fundamentals. You just make those transitions, make a few tweaks or adjustments, and now it works in the self-defense realm.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, that fits perfectly into one of the questions we got. And this question that comes up every time I talk to you and other people too. This is probably one of the most common questions I receive. It was from Chris, who I think is also Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. But it's one variation or another of the question of how do you balance training, street or self-defense with the sport and the art of what we do, and how do you work that balance out day to day when you're training?
Yeah, so one of the things I do, when we're doing, say, a warm-up for our CAP class, which is intermediate to advanced athletes, one of the warm-ups I like to do is first grip. And so whether we're standing or on the ground, whoever gets the first grip wins. And then the person who doesn't get the first grip has to pay in some way, like push-ups or burpees or something. It's just something to make it fun, not too punitive. But there's an incentive there to get that first grip. And so that applies heavily, especially in judo and jiu-jitsu, where we see athletes fail often in competition is they're too hesitant. They don't get that first dominant grip, and then they end up losing the stand-up fight. Or guard passing, they don't get the first good grip. If they do stand up out of somebody's guard, they don't establish a good grip and begin the passing, and the pressure of killing the legs, killing the hips, chest to chest, control the head, moving around. So we create this game of first grip. So we just focus on that one little tiny piece of the fight, a micro fight. And so winning that micro fight will help you win the macro fight, right? Mm-hmm. For self-defense purposes, what we'll do is, or just fighting, is I'm just going to try to touch your head. Like, I'm not going to try to whack you in the head, but all I'm going to do from the ground, so you're in upright guard, I'm standing, I'm going to move, or we can start in closed guard, and my only job in life is to try to touch your head. And if I touch your head, you have to do something, burpees, something. There has to be some punishment that you have to do because you let me touch your head. And we're going to do that. We're going to do 2-minute goes, and then we're going to switch places, and then it's my turn to try to keep you from touching my head. And what I just did was, it was a game, right? So we're always trying to disguise the reps. We're always trying to, make it so that they don't know they're really doing work, right? And so what I'm doing, though, is the student is becoming acutely aware of their opponent's hands in relation to their head, which the difference between a touch and a punch is I'm just going to close my hand and swing, right? And so that's where we developed the street side of it through a sport application, kind of like Chris Howder talks about, like thinking street but training sport. Thinking about the street is I never want somebody to punch me in the face. If I'm on the ground, I want to get up as soon as possible. If they give me the space to get up, I need to figure out how to get up safely. And so using the sport side of it, which is I'm just going to move around and you're going to try to touch my head. And I'm not going to let you touch my head no matter what. I'm going to keep my head untouched, which means in a fight, I'm going to stay conscious and mobile because I never catch any impact. And so those are the kind of ways that I have found I can balance it, where it has a direct sport application, but it also has an application of self-defense, which is I'm not going to let you touch my head. And then with the and we can actually do that with multiple opponents too, especially in foundations classes. I'll do that with multiple opponents where I'll have a second person. So they have the one person where they're one-on-one, facing each other, one up, one down. But then there's a second person who is also trying to move around the person that's down. So then there's a really heavy emphasis on doing a technical stand-up or stand-in base, like get up safely and start stacking these guys up and getting out of dodge, get out of there if you can. So I think finding ways to create those drills where the emphasis is on what's important, what's most important, the first principles of, stay upright, stay conscious, stay mobile. If we keep those things in mind, we can create drills based on those things that answer those questions of, well, how do I, because you and I both know it gets kind of boring after a while to just do certain things over and over again. And maybe that's a failing on my part, my mindset and that type of thing. But I really feel like I'm having fun now, kind of doing Granby rolls, not quite Berimbolo stuff, but like Granby rolls underneath the legs. And it's just challenging for me. It's interesting. I'm getting squashed doing it, but it's interesting. But that's not something that I would want to teach somebody who's going to have to fight tomorrow.
Right.
Like a street fight. That's just something that's of interest to me alone. And I think what we have to balance is what's interesting to me, what's cool to me after doing this for 20 plus years might not be what's necessary for the students. And so I've always got to keep that in mind and make sure that I'm doing those simple drills like that where the first touch on the head loses. Also equates to the first time you get cracked in the skull while you're down on the ground. How many of those do you have? 1, 2, I don't know, but I don't want to find out either. And I definitely don't want my students to find out. So creating those drills is how we balance the sport and street side. And I think one of the things too we have here and SBG Idaho is almost every coach, every one of our coaches has fought MMA. Mm-hmm. And so, or has worked like a door, bounced or done something like that. So we've got a lot of guys and gals who have that background of always thinking about striking. Mm-hmm. And so including that in there, it's not uncommon. We have they call it rolly punch. So we have a couple classes a week where people roll with gloves and just get used to strikes being involved. And that's really important. I think that's lost in some jiu-jitsu places. I don't see a whole lot of that training happening. And it's unfortunate because at the heart of it, jiu-jitsu is about fighting.
100%.
Bottom line, it's about fighting. And being able to deal with somebody trying to punch you while you're either standing or on the ground has got to be a component. And so I think it's important too for people that are training, if their academy doesn't offer that option for them, then they should probably find somebody they trust, a couple of training partners they trust, and throw some MMA gloves on and lightly, go at it a little bit and kind of see where those openings are. And they're going to find what we already know, which is there's 4 things they're going to have to do to be successful when strikes are involved, which are the exact same 4 things they have to do when strikes aren't involved, which is control the hands, control the space, work to a good position and while improving that position, and then end it through either submission or strikes. So it's going to be the same order, of priorities, but it's just when strikes are involved, if they haven't done it before, they definitely don't want the first time to be the real thing. So, yeah.
How much do you think is generational? Because for the first, as you know, the first probably 15 years I did jiu-jitsu, it was always that. Like basically, jiu-jitsu and Vale Tudo were interchangeable for us. It didn't matter if we were wearing a shirt or a gi or whatever. It was always that kind of jiu-jitsu. And then as I saw a change in the sport after the 90s and we came into the new millennium, and then you have a lot of academies that focused entirely on maybe tournament-based jiu-jitsu, IBJJF rules, and then that got lost. I wonder how much that is just generational, how old the instructors are and when they started jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. I think there's some, because I saw something with a pretty well-known instructor recently where he made a post about doing some jiu-jitsu while wearing a hoodie and choking people with the hoodie. And he said in the video, I'm pretty sure nobody's ever done this. And I remember thinking, like, I'm pretty sure they have, you know. But I think there's that little bit of that hubris where you're just caught up in your own magnificence, you know. And you know, I saw another thing. Somebody sent it to me. It was kind of funny. It was a post from a black belt, a younger guy, and he posted how I think he's been a black belt for like 3 years or something, but he's taught more seminars than anybody else in jiu-jitsu. And I was thinking, I'm pretty sure Hickson, Hoyler, Megaton, yourself, Matt, Chris Howder might have something to say about that. Guys that I personally know have been teaching 2 to 3 seminars a month for decades.
Right.
But
I think sometimes too, when these questions come up, people are anticipating that there's going to be a different class for street.
Yeah.
And, you know, the thing I always try and remind everybody is if you're working fundamentals and you're working with aliveness, doesn't matter.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Strikes or self-defense, it's all the same stuff. You know, people, I think once people figure that out, those questions kind of get answered for them.
Yeah, I think before we jump off of that one, I think the IBJJF has been awesome since 1996, right, is when they kind of came on the scene and started organizing things.
Sure.
I think they've been awesome for giving jiu-jitsu people who wanted to train in something specifically jiu-jitsu, giving them an avenue where, you know, like we've talked before, prior to 2010 even, if you wanted to compete in jiu-jitsu, it was a serious commitment to travel to Brazil or wherever to actually find competition. You know, our friend Cecil Birch traveled to Brazil to compete as a blue belt, and it was a major endeavor. And it was pretty much the only game in town. And so they've done some good things as far as that goes. But where I think the downfall is not the organization, but the athletes and coaches participating in it, just like in judo, where leg attacks aren't allowed. Like I can't grab your legs with my hands in judo. I can't have my hands on the same side of your body for too long in judo without making something happen. And so those rules were made for whatever reasons they were made for. However, where the failure occurs is when you have a coach or an athlete who says to you while training, that's against the rules. You can't do that. Well, not right now. It's not against the rules. Right now, if we're practicing judo and I grab, my hands are on both sides of your body. I got your right hand and your right lapel. There's no rules saying I can't throw you from there. Maybe in, USA judo events or something like that. And the same with IBJJF. If you and I are rolling around and I'm in half guard and you do the foot lock from top half guard where you sit back and grab my, like a twisting foot lock. If I say to you, that's against the rules, whose rules?
Right.
Like we're just rolling right now. We're just training. And if you can find a way to submit me, then submit me. I think the danger is that we take IBJJF or even in competitive shooting, say the International Defensive Pistol Association, United States Pistol Shooting Association, or Practical Shooting Association. We take their rule sets and then think that's the way, rather than coming in saying, listen, I am a complete jiu-jitsu artist. I am a complete martial artist. Just tell me the rules and I'll thrive. What are the rules of this event? That's all I need to know. Tell me what the rules are. Can I attack the legs? Can I attack the wrists? Can I attack the neck? What can I do and what can I not do? And then that's all we need to worry about. Yeah. But when we're training, we should be training to be as dangerous as possible in as many ways as possible under zero rule set. And then when it comes time to compete in International Defensive Pistol Shooting Association's rules, I have to wear a cover garment. I'm confined to certain things, placement of gear on my body. Okay, well, if I want to participate, that's not how I'm going to train every day, and that's not how I'm going to carry my own personal pistol every day. But if I want to compete in their organization, then I'll spend about, 10, 15 minutes a day practicing from a specific setup geared towards that sport. That's it. And I think for guys who want to train for self-defense, self-preservation, self-protection, all that good stuff, just training, learn the complete art, train everything, train always with strikes in mind. And then if you have a competition coming up, well, then that's what comp team practice is for. And in comp team practice, we'll do a specific rounds based on rules. We'll address specific attacks and strategies and tactics. And I think that's kind of where we as coaches and athletes lose sight of the ball or the goal, because we just think this is what jiu-jitsu is. It's this rule set, and it's not.
No, there's a lot of good stuff in there. You know, one thing I think John Frankel said before is like he's never, ever going to tailor his jiu-jitsu for IBJJF or anything else. He's always going to teach jiu-jitsu as a whole.
Yeah.
That's how I've always felt about it, and that's how I've always done it, and that's, I think, the SBG ethos. But having done that, you can see John, for example, has produced world champions, guys that have gone down and won their weight in the Mundials from Korea. And I've had champions come out of my own gym and win world championships. And I've never, ever taught a class that was just for IBJJF rules. It's always just been that. So if you learn just the art, you can go and play in all these different sports. You don't have to just, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong if somebody really wants to focus just on being a world champion and they just do IBJJF rules for years, if that's what they want to do. Mm-hmm. But for me and for the gym and for I think it's really important to teach the whole art. And I know you share that, but that's kind of how we've always approached it. Yeah. But it reminded me of what you were talking about, where you say you should be able to go and just say, hey, what are the rules, and then sign up. Like the pioneers of our sport, the guys who everybody respected the most, and the one that I was thinking of when you said that for sure was Holmes Gracie. That's what he was known for. He was in all that wrestling. So much of what we think is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu right now, in particular Rickson Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, a lot of it came from wrestling, and it came from Holmes, and it came from him wanting to do anything. He would go sign up for Sambo. He would go sign up for a lot of Greco-Roman stuff. Chris has talked about how much of what we do with our hips comes from Greco-Roman in particular in Jiu-Jitsu. And that's a result of Holmes being so open-minded and having that exact attitude that you just said. He didn't care. He just signed up for whatever the rules were.
Right.
And Rickson and Higgin, Machado, and those guys did the same thing. I remember, they famously would go and sign up for a judo tournament or a sambo tournament and win,
and win it. It's like, how'd that happen?
That's kind of a part of our sport, is that you can do that.
Yeah.
Coach Bazia from SBG South Africa had a good question. So he said, given the importance of distance management, when we're talking about self-defense, we're always talking about managing space, managing distance. So given that, he said, would you emphasize clinch in every single class you taught?
Yeah, I would emphasize clinch, and I would, more importantly, the principles of managing the space, control. I never want to deviate too far from those 4 core things, kind of like the prime directive, for Star Trek geeks, is that the prime directive is always going to be hands, space, position. Mm-hmm. Those 3, and then the 4th, of course, how I'm going to end it, But yeah, the principles of clinch, I think they come through in everything. Mm-hmm. If we're doing jiu-jitsu, because you're always going to be looking for base and posture. Even, and I've heard you teach it, and when you were here, you taught some mount stuff, and particularly from the bottom, you talked about even on bottom, you should have base and posture. Like, start off correctly, base and posture, even on bottom, and then we go from there. And where do we get our base and posture from when we're on bottom? Is from the ground. I can't use my opponent. I have to use the ground. And those principles are going to bleed through everything, whether we're standing or not. And especially if for self-defense stuff, guys that are concerned about self-defense, half guard is such, and I know we've talked about it before, where half guard is basically Greco, mm-hmm. And wrestling. If you have good wrestling, good Greco, good clinch, if I was short on time and I wanted to train clinch work and ground, I would just do half guard. I would just drill half guard stuff over and over and over again. Just, if, let's say, I had a 20-minute training session, I would do 2-minute goes with my training partner. That means we're both going to get about 10 rounds of one up and one down, and just drilling stuff. Pick something, work towards it, and just drill that for 2 minutes, and then switch. And I'm going to get
Reminds me of guys like Jeff Munson, who would come in with just super simple low singles from half guard bottom, and that with his wrestling background, that was enough to compete at the highest levels on bottom and jiu-jitsu, because it's so fundamental down there.
Yeah, yeah, and it gets you, and there's so much transfer of skill. So that's what I would do if I was in that position where, even if I was short on time, I would just train half guard.
Before COVID, I would often come in and teach a class based on particular position. But when I restarted it probably 2 years ago, started up my class again, I wanted to make a fresh start. Now, pretty much every class I start with breathing, and I'll do something from standing, just something related to base.
Yeah.
Before I take it down, I think it helps a little bit.
Yeah, we start foundations predominantly with standing, unless it's just something we need to pay attention to. And then in cat class, I'll do a lot from standing. We'll do even something simple, like the tails game from Growing Gorillas,
yeah.
But like the little short piece of belt in their back of their belt, yeah. And whoever could get that belt, the person that got the tail stolen, they have to pay up. You got to pay the man. So we'll do stuff like that just to keep their awareness of controlling hands. If I control their hands, they're never going to be able to access anything on me. They're never going to be able to hit me. They're never going to be able to get their own tools into play, and they're not going to be able to stop me from getting to my tools.
Right.
So if that's what's necessary, or being able to punch them. I was watching a pretty cool clip of Floyd Mayweather sparring, and I can't remember what channel it was on. It was sent to me. The guy was breaking down how Mayweather controls the opponent's hands with his jab. Mm-hmm. And so he would do this thing where he threw the jab kind of towards the right hand. So threw it towards his opponent's right hand. When the opponent committed his hand there, then Floyd would take his left hand and just kind of bring it across in a hooking motion and swat the other left hand out of the way. So now both hands of his opponent's hands are like this. And then he would just step in and throw that hook and cross. And it was pretty cool, but it was also just another demonstration of that principle of control the hands. Yeah. He's controlling his opponent's hands. He got his opponent to commit his hands to a path that did not benefit his opponent and benefited him immensely. And then he cracked him. And he just did it over and over and over again. It was pretty cool. But I think starting and standing, and then also further emphasizing, even when we're on the ground, control the hands, I think that would help everybody stand up a whole lot.
For sure. Question came in from Scott, the jiu-jitsu practitioner, also I think police officer. But he said strength and conditioning in Brazilian jiu-jitsu, a lot to maintain there, especially when you're working full-time and raising a family and all that. He's 45. So how does an older athlete like you in your 60s, how do you manage that?
Oh, man. Well, just I like the complete honest answer is just don't sleep much. And then but I think
Rob Wolf's not going to like that answer.
He's not going to like that at all. I think as you get older, as you progress, and the main thing is that injuries start to mount up. We start to accumulate all these injuries over time. I think we start finding some value in some of those training strategies that involve lower volume. Mm-hmm. And so we start regulating the overall volume. That's the hard part, is to regulate the overall volume. For somebody like me who has always trained a lot, always done a lot, I don't want to, man, it sounds arrogant, but I wouldn't use myself as a good example for what other people should do. I would not recommend what I do to people that I don't recommend what I do to people that I train. So people that I train, I typically will tell them, try to lift weights twice a week. Try to have some sort of strength session. Doesn't have to be weights, but some sort of strength building session twice a week. So a Monday and a Thursday, or a Tuesday and a Friday, some sort of twice a week, a strength session built around some sort of squat, a hinge, deadlift, or kettlebell swing, something like that, an overhead press, chinning and rowing, because those two motions are really important for what we do. And then some sort of bench, some sort of movement where you're horizontal and pushing up. I think and that's basically 5 movements twice a week. And heavier weight, 75% to 85% of your maximum, which for most folks, they're like, what's that even mean? Like, I don't know what my max is. So what I would say is pick a weight where it's difficult after about the 5th rep to complete the 6th or 7th rep. Do 2 sets of that, and you're going to be pretty good. You're going to be, I was talking to Rory Singer. One of his last competitions, he lifted weights twice a week. He just did strength training twice a week, did some conditioning work 2 or 3 times a week, and then spent the rest of his time just rolling and focusing on skill development. And he won pretty easily too, against a guy who was much bigger, much stronger, clearly enhanced, having some benefits, and acai bowls, I guess, I don't know. But I think for most people, 2 strength sessions a week, 2 conditioning sessions a week, and then a couple sessions a week where they roll is probably enough for what most folks want to do. And again, I'm not trying to make myself sound like I'm something special or anything like that. I think what I have is work capacity built over a long period of time. Lewis sent me a thing one time that he wrote about what he remembered of us in Florida. And I thought basically just described yesterday. I worked, I think it's like I worked all day doing construction down in Miami, but I'd started my morning with sprints and lifting weights, worked construction all day, went and trained jiu-jitsu and boxing for a couple hours, and then did a plyometric session there at the boxing gym we trained at, Lord's Gym. I did a plyometric session there and then lifted weights again and then drove home. And it was like an hour drive. I think doing that for so long, at this point, my work capacity is pretty decent. I can do a lot more, probably than I even need to do. I probably don't need to do as much as I do.
That kind of plays into what the 2 questions that John Frankel asked, which was the first one is if you could go back and tell yourself something different, if you had an opportunity to go back and give yourself advice early on in your training, what would it be?
Focus more on escapes. I would have focused more on escapes, and I would have focused more on training both sides equally, because it just seems like in any kind of fight that Murphy gets a vote, right? Murphy's Law shows up, and they're going to take you where you're not well prepared. And so if you always pass to the left, or you always have a combination that you throw that starts off of a hook, you're going to run into somebody that doesn't respond the right way to that. And so you can never really initiate and get your game going. So if I could go back, I would tell myself to focus more on escapes that were based on technical proficiency rather than having a boatload of attributes. I tell guys that train with me all the time that up until my first knee surgery, which was 2007, I could still dunk a basketball. So I could still dunk a basketball. I still could run 5 yards in just under around a second, and I could still cover 40. I could still do a 40-yard sprint from spread eagle. So you have to lay down flat and you have all your gear on and your hands on a stop plate. And as soon as you move, the time starts. So you have to jump up and sprint 40 yards. And I was doing that in like 6 flat, 5'9", 6 flat with all my gear. So having those attributes was awesome. It allowed me to do a lot of things that somebody without those attributes couldn't have done professionally and in sport. But it also was a curse because I didn't really need to learn how to create a long frame to escape from somebody crushing me in side control, because I could just explode out of there. Eventually with enough, bridging motion or whatever, I would get out. And same with mount. I would elevator people that I shouldn't be able to. Just by the 3rd or 4th time, they would be in the air and I'd get my knees under and go to butterfly. And I think if I could go back and talk to myself, if I would even listen, you know, being the arrogant, yeah, being the arrogant prick that I was, that probably wouldn't listen. But if I could go back and talk to him, I would tell him, like, focus on technical proficiency specifically for escaping and surviving and all the stuff that jiu-jitsu is supposed to teach us, which, right, escape and survive first. Focus completely on that and being really technically proficient at creating those frames, skinny X, all that stuff, and getting good connection before you even begin to apply everything else. Like for your escapes, connect, then start building the frames and all that. If I could go back and redo it, I probably would cut 10 years off my learning curve.
Mm-hmm.
You
so
know,
you're talking about going back and saying exactly what Hickson's has always said as far as his training progression.
Yeah.
Survival and defense with connection first and as a priority, and fighting out of bad spots, really bad spots, over and over again.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be something else. Yeah, just spend a lot of time getting out of bad spots and forcing myself to go back into them. Now, I will tell people that I spent a lot of time working my way out of bad spots and doing lots of rounds, starting in bad positions. But what I don't tell people is that I would start in those bad spots, usually get out in about 5 seconds, and then it's on. You know? And so, you know, what's that?
You were focused using on attributes to escape.
Yeah. Yeah. And then once I was out, I was like, I'm out. Let's just go. Let's just roll, you know, and then get a submission and then start over. And what I should have been doing is get out correctly, get myself out of there, and immediately reset.
Right.
Instead of, now let's just roll, you know? So I mean, that's what thousands of reps I missed out on.
Sure.
You know,
not just starting there, it's actually how many minutes you actually spend in that spot, right?
Yeah, exactly. You know?
So the other question John asked, which is a good question, is, and I think I know the answer, but you're now, for people that don't know, are you vegan or vegetarian?
Vegetarian.
Vegetarian. And is that something you recommend in general for people, or is that something you more recommend for yourself?
Yeah, just for myself. Yeah, I don't recommend it for anybody else. For some reason, red meat, just, I don't know what it is. And it's not even all the time, not even like a frequent thing, but, you know, I could have like a really nice cheeseburger, you know, which is kind of my Achilles heel, have a steak, different things, and nothing happened. And then a couple days later, I can go somewhere and have like just a small, like have somebody say, hey, try this. This is really good steak. And have a bite of it, and almost immediately I can feel it. You know, my eye will start watering, and then the headache, the migraine just boom, comes on. So for me, my neurologist suggested cutting red meat in the beginning of the aneurysm and all the migraines. I was having migraines 24 hours a day for like 3 months, and just getting to the point where I was really starting to tip over into a bad mental place because of the pain. I was getting really angry and just hard to be around. And so I cut the red meat, and immediately the headache stopped and did not return. And, you know, whether that would be the case now, I don't know, but there's always that fear, you know, of what would return. But overall, I want my friends to just enjoy their life. And if I go to, like, I've gone to barbecue places, you know, there's a place in Dallas called Heart 8. It's a really good barbecue place. My friends wanted to go there. And then it became this discussion of, yeah, but he doesn't eat meat, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, look, man, I'll figure it out. I would rather my friends enjoy a good meal and just the time with my friends. And I was able to eat, like, they have killer sides, you know, like you could have a whole meal of just sides, and I was fine. But yeah, I definitely don't recommend it. I don't, unless it's something that they experiment with. But as far as like the whole ethical, moral high ground that some people take with what they choose to eat or not eat. I'm not down with that. That's not my thing at all.
Yeah.
You know, I think those are the most annoying people. What's the joke? If you could get a person who's a vegan, a CrossFitter, and a jiu-jitsu person, if they all three were like, what would they talk about first? What would they start lecturing you about first? You know, it's like, yeah, there's so much weird politics associated with just something simple as food, you know?
For sure.
Yeah.
Rob Wolf's in particular, I mean, we all know to eat clean and not eat a bunch of sugar and stay hydrated. And there's things that are general for everybody, but it seems like a lot of the work he's done has shown that there's a lot more variation in how people's bodies react to particular foods than maybe people previously thought. You know, it might be a lot more individualized as far as what people should eat than a lot of people think.
Yeah, he's a really good resource. A lot of the stuff he's written and his podcast is really interesting. And I thought it was funny. One of the guys said, you know, how can you even listen to his podcast or something? Basically, you know,
Well, vegan, vegetarian friend of yours.
yeah. Like, how in the world would you even do that? And I thought it's good information. Like whether I can use, you know, I basically ate the carnivore diet the entire time I was doing strongman competition. It was called steak and eggs, and it comes from Vince Gironda was the first guy to come up with it back in the 50s and 60s when he was getting movie stars into shape. The way he would get them into shape was first thing he'd do is he'd make them cut out all processed food. They could only eat steak and eggs, and voila, 2 weeks later they're looking different, you know. And so in the strongman world, that was really popular. We would eat 5 1-pound packs of hamburger a day, you know, anywhere from a dozen to 18 eggs a day. We were no vegetables. Like, you know, like what am I going to do with that? You know, there's no time. Right. And plus vegetables fill you up, you know, too much. And so it just was counterproductive to eat vegetables. So I ate that way for years and years, and I benefited greatly from it. You know, I think you came out for the class with William April when I was kind of in the middle of all that, you know, and I was definitely a bigger, stronger, faster version of myself eating that way. And so my answer to that person was like, how can you even listen, or, you know, to Rao? What was it like to be around him in the same room and all this other? I was like, what in the world, man? It's not like I was hanging out with a serial killer, you know, but first, he's highly intelligent, well-spoken, well-articulated. And then the other thing is, like you said, we're learning that diet is more individualized than we ever thought. Right. And so if I have a student come to me and they're struggling with something, wouldn't it be better to have answers or at least have somewhere to direct them? I have students that do eat the carnivore diet or whatever you want to call it. I have students that eat all kinds of different ways. And so when they're getting ready for a competition or just, you know, they want to be healthier, it's good to have resources. It's good to have a variety of places to direct them and say, hey, go check this guy out. He's got it dialed in. He's got it figured out.
Absolutely.
You know?
Yeah. All right. Last question I got, which came from Coach Rich Bopit up in Niagara, but he said that, you know, personally, you've faced a lot of adversity. And how do you keep going when things get tough?
Man. Yeah, I think we've talked about that before too. That always comes up, and it's interesting. I think one of the things is that I feel like I have so many people around me that I just can't fail, that it's not going to last. Not to like, it's a good quote though, but it comes from the Bible, but it's a good quote. And having been a biblical scholar, I know it's out of context the way I use it, but there's a quote where Paul says, you know, there's so great a cloud of witnesses around you. So lay aside every weight and run the race. And some would say that that's talking about ancestors and about people in your life who have passed and they're now looking down on you from wherever they are. And others would say that it's more speaking to legacy of other martyrs, other people who have died for this cause. So why would you expect anything different from yourself? Do your duty and run the race, right? And meaning the race that's before you, meaning whatever comes next, should it be persecution or whatever. And for me, the way I know it's out of context, but the way that kind of speaks to me is like, I've got like you, Adam, Rory, my kids, Conley, like all the SBG guys. I've got all the Shivworks guys. I've got all these people all around me. I cannot run the race that's in front of me. Like I can't. Like, yeah, this is the race. This is what's set in front of me is adversity. What's set in front of me is insurmountable, seemingly. But with all these people around me who I could call you at 2 a.m. and be like, dude, I don't know if I can do this. And you would tell me that I could, or talk me through it or give me an alternative, or, I could call any number of people and they would fully support me, that to me, that's what powers me through those things. That's what drives me through those things. I would love from an arrogant or ego perspective to be able to say it's just something inside of me that just can't quit, won't quit. But that's not 100% true. I think there is some of that in everybody. And I think jiu-jitsu and combat sports in particular bring that out of us because we constantly do hard things. We constantly tackle difficult things. And so when you sit in your car and you're having one of those days, and you're just like, you can honestly speak to yourself and say, I do difficult things. I'm going to do this. It's like anything else in jiu-jitsu. I do difficult things. I just need to figure out like systematically, how do I work myself out of this bad position? And how do I get out of here? And how do I figure this out and then move forward and advance my position? And it's the same with life stuff, with facing adversity, where we just have to be able to, first off, honestly say, I do difficult things because I train and I do these things. But then the other thing is being able to just understand that I'm not in it alone. That the worst thing we can tell ourselves is that we're in it alone, that we're going through this alone, that nobody gets it, nobody understands. That I think that's one of the benefits of meditation, not to get too woo and all that. Obviously after using a scripture, not to get too woo, but one of the benefits of meditation is to hear that internal dialogue clearly and distinctly and begin to identify where my self-talk is self-sabotage, and to understand. And one of the first lies that I had to address I remember you introduced me to the Byron Katie stuff, the work and the 4 questions. And regardless of what anybody thinks about anything else related to her, those 4 questions are still valid, which is it true? And the first 2 specifically, is it true? And how do I absolutely know this to be true? And then who would I be without this thought? Like, how different would my life look like if I didn't have this thought? And so for me, some of the sabotaging self-talk that I was experiencing was nobody else gets it. Nobody else understands. Nobody else is dealing with what I'm dealing with right now and all that. But then to go, hold on a second, like whatever part of my brain that's coming from, I need to counter that with, is that true though? Right? No, it's not. People are going through much worse, and they're thriving and they're moving forward. And in this day and age, with all the technology that we have, you can find thousands of examples of people on Instagram or YouTube or wherever who are going through what you're going through or much worse, and they're doing okay. They're thriving. So if they can do it, you can do it. So immediately I had to counter that internal dialogue and respond with what's true, right? Like, that's not true. And how do I absolutely know that that's not true is because there are a whole lot of people who with a simple phone call would be there for me. And so if I'm choosing to go through this by myself, then that's exactly what's happening. I'm choosing this. I'm choosing to suffer. I'm choosing to go through this adversity when I could just reach out, like stuff my ego and reach out to somebody and be like, man, I'm having a hard time. You know, like, what would you recommend I do right now? And that could open up all kinds of doors of possibility. But the most important thing is, and it's kind of like like we talk about in jiu-jitsu all the time, like search for connection, find connection. Like you can't do anything until you connect. And then you can start implementing a plan, you know? So it's the same thing. If I connect with people, then I can start seeing, like, here's my way out. You know, like I connected, let me work my way out. I think I talked about this with Andy Stump one time. What do you think comes first? The will to push yourself through things, or you get yourself into something and then you build will by doing the thing? Like, how does it, chicken and egg, right? How does that happen? And he's got so much experience as a buds instructor, seeing people who just are at their edge, and still continuing on. And so we were kind of talking about that, and it's really a mystery. I think if they could ever solve that mystery, it would be, like that would be a huge breakthrough for all kinds of performance issues. But I think
he didn't know. He didn't have an answer.
He kind of feels like it's a little bit of both. Like the personality is there, it's in that person, and that's why they pick that thing. And sometimes they pick something like a Misogi, right? That challenge that you might not be able to do. They pick something that's beyond their grasp. Now, does it break them or not? That's the thing. If they make it or don't make it, if they don't make it, do they come back and try again? Or does it break them? And that's kind of the piece that's interesting, because is that nature or nurture, basically, right? Is that in them, or was that installed in them that, hey, you tried, you failed, that's it, or it breaks them, like literally they are broken. And from that point forward. And so it's interesting to talk about that and think about it. And I think about it a lot from the perspective of training people, just like you do. We think about this stuff all the time because we're training people for what might be the worst day of their life. Things might get really bad. And so we want them to be prepared to persevere and push through, drive through whatever it is. And so I think as far as like facing adversity for myself, facing those challenges for myself, I think it's been a mix of being raised around people who were like, things will always get better, but you got to be in the fight. Like you have to be in it, or, and then also though, being put in situations where I learned that I can push further than I thought I could, that I can go further than I thought I could. There's always one more round in you. There's always one more mile, one more rep. There's always one more. And so sometimes the internal dialogue gets a little dark, as far as just not dark really, but just minimal, like sometimes the internal dialogue can be like, just walk down the stairs, like make the coffee, walk out the door, get in the car, go to work. It could be just, but that's what you need to do in that moment to get through, to get to the next place where something better might occur, if that makes sense. Yeah, it's sometimes it's kind of hard to articulate it, because if you go too far into it, you start sounding kind of like a psycho, but but then I think for guys like us and people that are, what's it?
Talking about internal dialogue, is that what you mean?
Yeah, internal dialogue and just that whole mindset piece. I think for people like us, it's kind of almost like, it's accepted, like we get what we're doing. I think for people who are kind of curious about it, it can be a little daunting
Mhm.
a little intimidating sometimes, the language involved and the discussion involved, because they're like, well, hold on, man. You're talking about like things like in Grant, like memento mori, like you're going to die and you recognize you're going to die. But you're going to choose to fight as hard as possible until that last moment, and yeah. And I think people don't understand that, or maybe they just don't grasp that how we do anything is how we do everything. And something as simple as how you wash your dishes, matters. How you are with your kids, how you talk to people, how you conduct yourself when nobody's around. Those things matter. And those things are all deposits into an account that you might one day have to draw from to save your own life or the life of someone else. And might not even be from malevolent intent, another human being trying to kill you. It could just be something simple like you're in your car, you're in your garage, and the emergency brake gave and the car, is crushing you against the wall. Do you have the willpower to fight through that? Do you have the willpower? Have you made enough deposits into that willpower bank account where you refuse to stop trying?
Yeah.
Like you are going to go, even if that is the last thing you're ever going to do, you're going to try until it is the last thing you do. The last thing you do should be trying to live.
Yeah.
And I think it's something we learn every day. I just don't think we're always aware that we're learning it.
Yeah. That's really good. I was actually trying to quote you, I don't know if it was last night or the night before, to Salome about that putting deposits in the bank thing, but I got it all wrong and she had no idea what I was talking about.
I would just blame it on her ESL. I mean, listen, this is your fault. You don't understand what I'm trying to say.
100%. Let's finish up talking a little bit about some of the court stuff that came up in 2021. And before I start, I'll go with the last question I got actually from Robert Verdell, which is a good question. And the analogy he used was he's a teacher, and he's talking about sometimes as a teacher, you'll see bad teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't necessarily, there may not be the environment isn't conducive to pointing them out. And he was wondering how much of an issue that is with law enforcement. And I think that ties really well into what I noticed when I was watching that, when I was reading the comments on that talk you gave about Ahmaud Arbery. They were generally positive, but the thing that I found the most interesting was almost everyone that was positive, it was positive, and then there was a little piece in there where they said something along the lines of, I can't believe this guy was a police officer. In other words, they had this mindset already coming into it with a mindset that, like, how could a police officer be that rational and fair about a particular issue like that? Like, that surprised them.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's a mystery where that comes from based on our media and what we see out in the media, but it does feed into his questions. So, how big of an issue is it, are bad cops to begin with? Are people's perception of it in any way close to how the reality of the actual problem?
I don't think so. In my experience, there was one cop that was fired for misconduct in the early part of my career. And I think what people forget is who arrests those guys,
Mm-hmm.
who prosecutes those guys. It's not some secondary, private entity. It's other officers.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the problem, I think part of the problem is that it's hard to speak out against certain behaviors if you don't know about it. If you don't know it's happening.
Right.
But what I have witnessed personally is once it's identified and once they know it's happening, they move swiftly. And people misunderstand the thin blue line or the terminology around that kind of stuff. And the way it was always conveyed to me was that And I was part of that officer being fired for misconduct. And I was a rookie. I was on probation. I was terrified. I don't know if I ever told you about that, but I was scared, man. Some things that went down and involved a guy with some mental disabilities and this officer. And I was the first guy on scene, and literally sitting in a parking lot. We just got coffee, and I'm sitting in a parking lot with another officer, and we're kind of car to car, just chatting a little bit right before his shift starts. And he hears this guy call out with this young man, and he says, that guy's going to get somebody fired one day. He's bad news. I don't know what it is. Can't put my finger on it, but something's not right. Stay away from him. You're new. Stay away from him. And I was just like, being new, I was like, yeah, okay, cool. And just like, but then he calls out asking for help. And I look over at the other guy, and he just kind of rolls his eyes. He's like, we got to go, but I just don't want to be near anything that guy's doing. And sure enough, it ended up being the situation that caused him to be fired. I had to write a memo. I was questioned about it in the internal. And I remember standing in the locker room, and I'm brand new, man. They don't even know my name. There's a 5-year rule where it's like, basically, if you're a rookie with less than 5 years on, just shut up. Nobody wants to hear from you. You don't know enough to have an opinion. Right. And so I'm in the locker room, and one of the senior officers who I admired, like just a good street cop, really good. Like I had been on calls with him where I was like, wow, like took control of chaotic scenes without being like screaming, hollering, just took control, and immediately people just knew he was in charge. And everybody, like the citizens freaking out or whatever, like it's as soon as he started talking, people were just like, that was it. This guy is in charge. And so I had a lot of admiration for him. He came up to me in the locker room when this was all going down. He goes, listen, he goes, no matter what happens, you tell the truth. Period. We are the thin blue line. And what you have to remember is that if he crosses that line, then the people who are on the other side of the line that we are supposed to protect, he is basically the enemy. He is the bad. He is what we're trying to protect ourselves and everybody else from. Mm-hmm. If he's chosen to cross that line, he does not deserve the protection. So you tell the truth. Mm-hmm. And I was just like, whoa. And then he walked off, And then a sergeant, same thing, just a legend. This sergeant had been, like, one of the incidents that happened when I got there, he was drugged under a car, like a stolen car thing. And the guy got he reached into the car to try to grab the guy, and the guy took off. And he ended up getting drugged under the car, and he's just cracking rounds. He's old school, carrying a 1911, and he's cracking rounds through the floorboard of the car and ends the incident. So he's a legend. What's that?
Did it work?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so he's just a legend, And I'll tell you a funny story about him too, but just a legend. He came up to me and he's like, hey, listen, I don't know what happened out there. I don't know anything about what's going on, but I hear rumors. And here's what you need to understand. Tell the truth. And he walked off. And I was like, huh. Not once did anybody come up to me and, like in the movies, where you get the guys giving them the pressure to, hey, man, keep your mouth shut, this and that. It was completely the opposite. So my experience, of course, my opinion is biased by my experience, right? My experience was tell the truth and root these guys out. They don't deserve to be here. They are trusted, and it's incredibly trusted by the public. I don't know what the statistics are now, but I do know that in the past, I believe police officers, nurses, and priests were like the most trusted professions.
Mm-hmm. Used to be.
Yeah, it used to be, right? So that's an incredible weight that the public has placed on you as a police officer, and you violate that, you're done, man. And especially if you do something that deserves you going to prison, you don't get protective custody. You don't get anything. You know, stick them in general pop and let them deal with it, because they betrayed the public that trusted them.
Mm-hmm.
And they tainted the rest of us, who are doing our best to be what we're supposed to be. Mm-hmm. And so, man, it just, in my experience, speaking out was easy.
Yeah, what you did, right? I remember, it's a funny, it reminded me of something with my dad when I was a kid, but I grew up in the 70s watching Harry, Dirty Harry movies and all that kind of stuff. I have an impression, and my dad's a police officer, so I have my dad, and then I have what I see on TV. And I remember a kid one time asking him, like, he was a detective at the time, and I said, if you could do any job in the police, what would you do? And I was wanted to hear something cool like SWAT or something. And he said internal affairs, which immediately, as a kid, I don't remember how old I was probably like 9 or 10, but in my mind that was bad, because those were always the guys that everybody hated in the dirty area.
Yeah.
And I said to him, well, why internal affairs? And he said, because there's nothing worse than a bad cop.
Right. Nothing.
That seemed to be just the general attitude that most of the officers I grew up knowing had. So
I think what happens, man, not to interrupt you, but I think what happens is that we really don't want to talk about it. And so, what's that?
You mean to the public?
Yeah. It's like, do you really want to air that? Like, say like my mom was like a crackhead and prostitute and all this stuff. I'm dealing with it. Do I want to tell the rest of the world about it? It's embarrassing.
Dirty laundry and give everybody a bad impression.
Yeah, like everybody's going to be like, oh, what the heck, man? And it's the same with that stuff. Like, it's embarrassing. Mm-hmm. And we know inevitably people will not, because it's human nature, right? It's actually an evolutionary thing, right? To create stereotypes. Like, hey, if I knew that every yellow lab if I've been bit by only yellow labs, then in my mind, all yellow labs bite. Stay away from them. So that's just a survival mechanism, so we have less things to think about and process. If I put it out there and then the news runs with it, now people just think all cops are bad.
Yeah.
Or they think it's more rampant than what it actually is. Mm-hmm. That it's just, and there's this media Hollywood portrayal of always covering these guys up, always, making allowances for these guys. And that's just not the case. But I think what happens is we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to get brushed with that same brush. And so it's like, okay, it's over, done, forget about it. Mm-hmm. That dude does not exist, mm-hmm. And I think sometimes in law enforcement, that's to their detriment. Mm-hmm. They make mistakes as far as how they handle media releases and things like that. Like,
I can see just an absolute utter distrust of the media, though, after you've done that job for a few months, just knowing what I know and then seeing how the media reports it. I have an absolute, if I'm going to be honest, disdain for the media at this point in my life. So I can't imagine what you feel like as a police officer. Yeah,
it's hard. I have friends that work in the media that I know are doing their best to do a good job. But here's the thing. They all work in like sports.
Right.
You know what I mean? They have all, over time, migrated over to sports.
Somewhere where they can tell the truth.
Yeah, somewhere where they can just say what it is, And it's difficult because you wish that an administration or public information officer, somebody would get in front of things and say, this is what happened, this is what we're doing, this is how we handled it. Oh, and by the way, statistically, less than 0.01% of all police officers are bad or corrupted. Mm-hmm. And when we do catch them, we run them out.
Mm-hmm.
They get whatever we can give them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if the state's attorney, what people forget is that, and I don't agree with it, but what they forget is that, you know, they'll see some guy who's had 4 DUIs who, you know, unfortunately on his 5th DUI runs into a family and kills them. And then that guy gets 3 years. And they have outrage. They can't understand that. And then they'll have an instance of a police officer who embezzled money from some program or something he was supposed to be running for whatever, social groups. And they'll see where he got probation. You know, lost his job, was fired, lost everything, and he got probation, or he got 30 days in county.
Mm-hmm.
And people are outraged, rightfully so. But what they forget is that the standard sentencing for that offense for everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that's right. I don't agree. As a police officer, if you screw up, you should be slam danced. Right? Again, back to the trust thing. The public trusted you and you violated it. There should be a harsher sentence,
Mm-hmm.
in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
There should be a much harsher sentence for the sentinels, the guardians, the people that we trust to do the right thing, to protect and to serve. There should be a harsher sentence. However, if the prosecution, the judge, the jury, if they all decide that this is what everyone gets who commits this offense with no prior criminal history,
right,
that's how it is.
Yeah.
We, the people, have voted for and allowed that system to remain in place.
Right.
Good, bad, and ugly. It's what it is. But it's because of us. Because we, the people, vote for those judges. They are in place by vote. And also, we don't make our voices heard on those types of things. Like Mike, people that I worked with, people that in the state's attorney's office or judges or whatever, knew my opinion on that kind of stuff. You know, like, hey, look, if there's an officer, there was 4 guys who were undercovers who were busted for stealing the dope that they were supposed to be taking into evidence, and they were selling it. They were doing scumbags. They had crossed the line and were now criminals. And when it came time to sentence these guys, there was a lot of outcry because of their sentencing, you know, and people attributed to this or to that. But again, we come back to no prior criminal history, all the factors that are factored in.
Sure.
And also, how is everybody else sentenced having committed this offense? You know, and I remember having a conversation with one of the Cook County state's attorneys, and I said they should go away for life. You know, because they knew exactly what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
They worked as undercovers, so they've convicted people for mandatory sentencing for these same things. They should go away for life.
Right.
They violated the public's trust. Not only did they violate the public's trust, but cases that I worked on and other officers worked on were now being brought forward for appeal.
Right.
Right? Fruits of the poisonous tree. By association, maybe those cases now were tainted. Because
everybody's work, right?
Yeah, because in my situation, one of those guys had sat in a surveillance car a couple blocks away only as a deconfliction because it was a separate agency. And so he was in the car because he had their radio frequency and he was just there. Also, he knew the area better. So he was just there as like a deconfliction guy. Like, hey, if we need to call for patrol officers to come into the area to assist us, or I need to give you guys directions on where he's probably going to run to, we had somebody.
Mm-hmm.
That's all it took for a really good case to come up for appeal and face being overturned. And we had to argue hard that this guy had nothing to do with, he never even got out of the car. He never touched anything that would have messed with the outcome of that case. But yeah, that's frustrating. You know, like, we're trying to do good work here, and you have some dirty cop that messes it up. Man, launch that dude.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
launch him, man. He violated everybody's trust involved,
Yeah.
you know, knowingly.
Well, before we go, I have to ask. Let's talk briefly about the Rittenhouse case, and I have one question for you on this case.
Yeah.
Because I followed it pretty carefully from the beginning, from the initial when it initially happened. I watched the videos like everybody else, and then I followed the court case pretty carefully. And to be truthful, when the sentence was read out and he was found not guilty, it was a huge relief for me and my whole family when we were watching, because I think it would have been a travesty had anything else happened. That's my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
But then I'd see the country is almost split, and you had about half of, I don't know what it is numerically, but it seems like half, and if not more, in the media who felt just the opposite about it. And if they legitimately not followed the case, and the only thing they knew about that case was what they saw watching The View or a couple CNN segments that they watched, and they don't know yet that CNN isn't news, then I could kind of understand that opinion. But if they had followed the case at all and still felt that he should have gone to prison in that particular case, I'm at a loss for understanding what they're thinking. And I'm wondering if you can provide an answer for me on what people like that you think what's going through their head.
I think the biggest issue, which is my only issue with everything that went down, was he shouldn't have been there.
Right. But nobody should have been there.
Right. Yeah, this is true. Nobody should have been there. But I kind of, when I look at it, I'm just from a person who focuses on like the avoidance, deterrence, and de-escalation pieces of it all, especially as it pertains to self-defense. Like, don't put yourself in a situation where you have no legal authority. You have no, like, I don't need to be there. You know, like, it's not my job.
I completely agree with you. And
yeah,
as a father,
right. And
of course, I would never want my son to be there, and I wouldn't have wanted him there with a rifle or anything like that. But the flip side, the people on the other side of that will say, well, the police weren't there, the government wasn't there, they had completely abdicated their responsibility to the community and stood down while mobs of violent felons, these were child rapists and wife beaters and everything,
yeah.
were lighting fire to the community. So in that case, is it to the point where people just have to let the city burn then?
No, yeah, and that's a good point. That is the other side of that argument, is somebody needed to protect these folks' livelihoods.
Right.
You know, people love to use the word business.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was just a business. Well, you and I both know a business can be your heart and soul.
Yeah.
You've poured everything into building this business, and now random people who probably aren't even from the area are going to burn this thing to the ground. Mm-hmm. For what purpose? Mm-hmm. You know? And so I get it. I totally get everything from that side. From a perspective of self-defense, I think most telling, Andrew Branca, The Law of Self-Defense, he does a good breakdown on a lot of this stuff, video breakdown and everything, where he goes deep into the legal side of self-defense and its use in all 50 states. He has a book where he breaks down the laws of self-defense in every state, and it's really interesting. I think anybody who does this stuff should read that book. Mm-hmm. And definitely check out his YouTube. He breaks this stuff down in a very concise way and really just dives deep into all the legal aspects, and that would really help people understand it a lot better. Understand what happened and how things went the way they went as far as the ruling goes. If we just look at the situation as it was, the fight itself, mm-hmm. right? He's getting hit in the head with a skateboard, so that's lethal right there. That's the use of lethal force there. And anybody who would question that, or, you know, serious bodily injury, death, right? Anybody who thinks that I can't hit you in the head with a skateboard and that metal truck or even the side of that board hit you in the head and not cause permanent damage is delusional. Mm-hmm. Right there, you know. And then the admission by the survivor of he pointed the pistol at him, raised the pistol, pointed the pistol at him, right there, again, immediate defensive life is apparent. We have immediate defensive life. There's really nowhere for him to run. He's on the ground. There's nowhere for him to go. At that point, I think we have checked most of the boxes necessary for self-defense, again, in that microcosm, in that moment. You know, everything that I think or disagree with prior to whatever led to that moment, all of it. I don't agree with anything that was happening up to that point. The rioters being there, you know, all those guys, the guys on the other side of it feeling like they had to go out there armed and defend property. You know, we all joke about the rooftop Koreans in LA after that went down. The Rodney King verdict came down, and people would joke about, you know, make funny memes about the rooftop Koreans and stuff. And but there is that piece of it where if law enforcement has abdicated their responsibility and even been told to stand down, not to defend.
Yeah, I have no doubt they were told to stand down, right? It's not what they wanted to do, probably.
No, of course not. You know, and now, so what are we faced with? What can we do? You know, I'm not inclined to sit back and let somebody burn my house down.
Right.
You know, and so I understand the arguments, all that good stuff. So what we really have to look at is what happened in that little bubble with those 3-4 characters. You know, what went down in there? Impact weapon to the skull or attempted to the skull. That's the threat of serious bodily injury. A pistol directed at him, at the person. Again, death, immediate defensive life. He was armed with a rifle. They can argue back and forth about did he raise the rifle, which caused the other guy to raise the pistol? I'm not sure. What testimony sounds? It sounds from testimony that he raised the pistol.
Right.
And then in response, he raised the rifle. That's by his own admission in testimony. And then he let rounds go on him, on the guy that pointed the pistol at him. At that point, I would think he's justified.
Yeah.
You know, at that point, and the jury.
He wound up in that position because he was being chased down while he was trying to go to the police.
Right. That's the other thing. It wasn't a pure just I'm standing here and this is the line I'm drawing. It is I'm running away and I find myself on the ground trying to run away. And now what am I going to do? You know, and you have to be judged by that moment, you know, not all the other stuff that people want to bring into it. I think if people were to really listen to, again, somebody like Andrew Branca, somebody were to pay attention to like his breakdown on it and some of the other things, and just understand the law of self-defense as it pertains to the United States. A lot of times you have people from Europe and other countries who want to weigh in, and that's cool, but they don't understand how the law works here.
Right.
You know, and I remember talking to a student that came through, it was one of the Scandinavian countries, and he was talking about if he's defending himself and he punches somebody and they fall and hit their head, he's now responsible for their injuries, even though he was the one that was being attacked. And he was trying to explain that to me, and I don't know if that's completely accurate. I don't know if his understanding of their law is completely accurate. But based on what others have said in regard to self-defense incidents in the United States, I would say that there is a distinct difference between our understanding and approach to self-defense versus European countries. And that's part of the problem, is when those guys start weighing in, they don't understand those things. Like,
unfortunately, I'm talking about Americans.
Yeah, that's the bad part, right? It's like, well, man, the thing is, I would want Americans to understand the laws of self-defense too, as it pertains to them. Because God forbid they ever need to defend themselves, they need to know if they're moving correctly, you know, within the law. Or are my actions legally justified?
Right.
You know, like that lady, the Walmart shoplifting lady who fired the concealed carry lady who saw them chasing a shoplifter and decided she's going to help by shooting at the guy. Well, you can't do that,
Right.
you know. But those are the kinds of things that lead to people not understanding and making the comments that they make when they see rulings like this come down. They don't understand how the law of self-defense works.
Right.
And so I think
anybody that looks at a guy who's convicted of multiple counts of child rape and who's trying to set buildings on fire and calls him a protester is probably lacking a certain amount of mental judgment to begin with.
yeah.
Around that. But the other piece about it is I don't think I've ever seen anybody that made my skin crawl as much as Binger, the prosecutor in that particular case. He just rubbed me the wrong way in every possible sense of the word. But there was a moment where his chubby partner there, the overweight guy, is talking about how sometimes you just have to take a beating. And I remember watching that when it happened, watching it live and thinking to myself, I don't think that's what Paul Sharp would say.
Yeah.
It's his particular advice as a prosecutor that sometimes people just have to take a beating. What would you say to anybody that was naive enough to think that there's some wisdom there?
Yeah, I would say, okay, well, then the next time there's a domestic battery arrest, that's going to be, if I was the defense attorney, that would be my defense.
Yeah. Right. Prosecutor such and such said sometimes you just have to take a beating. So she had to take a beating.
Yeah, so it was her turn to take a beating. It was his turn to take a beating. You know, the prosecution even said, this is the state's view on interpersonal violence. The state's view is sometimes you just need to take a beating. And so I want all charges dropped.
Yeah.
I want my client to walk out of here free today. Yes, he beat the crap out of somebody, but sometimes you just got to take a beating. You know, when they say ridiculous things like that, it's like when all those those two girls were fighting and the one girl stabbing the other girl and the police officer responded. You had all these celebrities talking about there was knife fights all the time when I was in school. No, there wasn't. No, there wasn't.
I think that was one of the women that runs BLM there, but she said, well, yeah, sometimes knife fights are just part of growing up, you know?
Yeah, no. Knife fights are part of dying, not growing up.
Yeah.
You know, like people die when knives are involved. So yeah, it's just ridiculousness. And I think what ends up happening is that rather than trying to understand the laws of self-defense, trying to understand the difference between a civil and a criminal action, and trying to increase our understanding of that, what we do is we take the easy route, which is listen to some talking head who even knows if they know what they're talking about,
right,
or how educated they are, and on the subject matter, and we listen to them and go, oh, okay, well, that's my opinion now. You know, I did my research. You know, that's my opinion, and so we just run with it instead of trying to dive deeper in and examine it and say, well, what if I'm wrong? What if my opinion about this is wrong? What if I don't know what the law of self? You know, I had interesting interaction with somebody when I was living in Illinois about castle doctrine and stand your ground, because that was kind of a big deal at that time. They were talking about the Trayvon Martin, I can't remember the other guy's name, but anyway, they were talking about that issue. You know, Zimmerman Trayvon Martin incident. And they were talking about that, and they were discussing stand your ground, castle doctrine, and all these things, and completely misunderstanding any of it, not understanding any of it, and misapplying, you know, being able to defend yourself in your home with being out in the street, getting into a situation, all these different things. And I just thought, you know, we really should, in school, at high school, junior high level, have a deeper discussion, educational process regarding all these things, regarding civil, criminal, all of it. We really should have some more time on that at that level, because this person was probably 21. They were in college. And so these are opinions that are being formed and cemented into place. Like, this is what I believe. And they're going to carry that forward into wherever and whenever they end up in life. But it just was one of those things where I was just thinking, Like there's nothing I'm telling you right now, all these resources you can go to find legitimate information on these things. All the things that you're telling me that you like, I wasn't telling them, hey, you are completely wrong. Like you're so wrong you can't find right. I wasn't telling them that. Instead, I was trying to point them towards resources. And I talked to them a few days later and go, hey, by the way, did you ever check out any of the stuff I told you to check out? Yeah, but it didn't make any sense.
Yeah.
No, it does make sense. It's just you have to unplug your bias for a moment and try to examine it with just an open mind and the willingness to accept that maybe you don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
You know, but yeah, I think if more people understood that, just simple things like the law of self-defense and what does the law of what are the statutes regarding self-defense look like in the state they live in? Mm-hmm. Have they ever even read it? Have they ever even checked it out? Have they ever talked to an attorney that specializes in self-defense? Have they ever talked to that person and found out what can I or can I not do in the place that I spend the majority of my time?
Yeah, well, that's a great point. And well, let's one last one because somebody asked about it, and we'll end it on that because I'm taking up a ton of your time. But what about the Kim Potter case?
Man, that's a rough one. For me, from a training perspective, I'm always curious to see where was the equipment that was misused placed on their body.
Right. Was she reaching the place where she normally reached to pick it up? Or
yeah. So for me with the taser, I always wanted to see with the guys I trained, I wanted to see the taser either on their armor, on their carrier, like on the chest, or on their left side of their body. Both places, though, I wanted a left-handed holster. I wanted something that was, or if they're right-handed, right? If they're left-handed, I want a right-handed taser holster. I wanted it so distinct and different from the regular draw stroke of a pistol that they would actually have to think about it. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm going to access my taser means I'm going to have to use my left hand and do something that I never do to produce a lethal weapon. Mm-hmm. So and I started doing that after I saw, I want to say it's New York, but I'm not 100% on that. It's been quite some time. A officer had the taser in a thigh holster directly under the service weapon. Mm-hmm. And guy in the back seat goes to tase, says, taser, 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 pulls a pistol and shot the guy in the chest while he's handcuffed in the back seat of the car. Is a taser use appropriate when they're handcuffed in the back of the car? By SOP, yes. You know, you can tase somebody to get control of them if they're in the back of the car, kicking the windshield or kicking the windows out. You know, I've seen guys get kicked in the face before trying to deal with somebody handcuffed in the back of a car. It's basically an up kick. It sucks. There are other ways to deal with that. But in her case, the taser was an authorized use of force. However, because of where she had it placed, when she dropped her hand down, she grabbed her Glock instead of the taser and killed somebody. Immediately, as soon as that came down the pipe, through various use of force, emails, training, that kind of thing, we immediately started telling our guys, you have to mount the taser in a distinct position on the left side of your body or on the opposite side of your strong hand, on somewhere where you will have to think consciously about drawing that tool. So for me, it was always on my armor, up high, left hand. So I would have to use my left hand to present it. A completely distinct and different, separate movement than my gun hand. And so if I were to look at what happened with her, I would want to see how her gear was set up and how much training she had on it. I know she had spark tested it 6 times out of the last 10 times that she had worked. So she had 6 occasions where she had pulled it out and tested it. You know, they call it a spark test. You just fire it to make sure it's working without shooting the prongs out or whatever, and make sure the batteries are up and all that good stuff before you go into service. So she had spark tested it 6 times. I don't know how many times she had dry practiced with accessing her taser. I don't know how many times she had practiced accessing that taser under duress against a resisting opponent. You know, you take the training cartridges out, it's just the empty shell, the holder of the taser, and you just practice getting that thing out while you're fending somebody off or making space or giving verbal commands. And they also have training cartridges you can use for that too. I don't know. I'd like to see. I really would like to, just for curiosity, like to see what the training records are on that and how often she did that. I think her sentence, if I understand the law in that area, my understanding is they did not prove that she intentionally killed, that she intentionally pulled the pistol, that she at any point in time realized that she had pulled the pistol instead of the taser and continued anyway. All those things would prove intent. I don't know that they proved that. So I don't really have too much of an opinion on what went down legally as far as the ruling and all that. I do know that there's probably going to be a civil case coming too, you know, in addition to the legal cases. I'd be interested to see what happens on appeal, just from a curiosity standpoint, and also as a kind of like an informal student of our legal system. I love reading case law and seeing how judges interpret different things and arguments are presented. I think it's really interesting and educational for all of us to understand how our system works, particularly something as large as the judicial branch and the power that holds in our governmental system. I think more people should spend time reading case law and that kind of thing, and especially reading arguments. Some attorneys give some really good arguments and present perspectives that we might not think about when it comes to these kind of things. And I'd be curious to see, because of course there's going to be an appeal, because the judge did not instruct the jury on intent as it pertains to manslaughter. And so obviously there's going to be an appeal. And so I'm curious to see how that's going to play out. But I think as far as her actions and what we can learn from her actions, you know, she killed a man, right? Who, by all accounts, did not deserve to be killed. There has to be a price to be paid for that. There's just no way around that. And I know it's unfortunate, and I know that I feel for her. I would not want, I've had nightmares about being in that place, you know. I've had nightmares about making the wrong call, you know, and choosing the wrong thing in that moment. You know, that's the stuff nightmares literally are made of. And so I know a little bit about that night. I don't know what she's going through, but I know what it's like to just wake up going, did that really happen? You know, like, did I really? And then realize, like, no, man, it's just a nightmare, you know? So, but it does not negate the fact that someone was killed. It shouldn't have happened. It was due to a mistake, and there has to be a price paid in some way. And I am not a good one to ask about that part of it, because I don't know what is a just price to pay for. And I think about it from both sides, right? Like, you know, like when you're interviewing a suspect, you know, sometimes one of the questions you'll ask them is, hey, so I realize you didn't do this, but what do you think we should do to the guy that did do this when we catch him? You know, like, what do you think should happen? And most of the time, if they're guilty, if they're the ones that did it, most of the time they'll come back with some lenient sentence. Like, man, yeah, man, I think you should get some therapy, you know, and I don't think you should be locked up for a long time, but I think, like, maybe, like, you know, 30 days in the county or something, and and in like a program, you
Right.
know. And if they didn't do it, most of the time they're like, that dude should be launchable, should be gone, you know. So in this situation, it's hard for me as somebody who was an officer in situations like that. It's hard for me to be completely biased, but as a person who has loved ones, you know, it's also hard for me not to go, man, that was my kid that was killed accidentally or not. They were killed when they shouldn't have been killed.
Sure.
I want justice, you know. But then there's the other side of me that goes, it was an error. They didn't prove intent. It was an accident, man. And that sucks. Living with that accident would be a prison you will never escape.
Yeah.
Right? Like a normal person will never escape that prison and will probably never have another normal day in their life.
Right.
They will be tormented until the day they die if they don't expedite the process of death.
Right.
You know? So it's tough, man. That is such a hard call to make. But for me personally, as a trainer, I would really want to see her training records and how the gear was placed on her body. And if there were SOPs, standing operating procedures, or uniform regulations in place regarding where the taser is placed on the body, how often she practiced, and how often she was placed in practicals or scenarios where she had to access the right tool at the right time under duress.
Mm-hmm.
You know, those are the things that are really interesting to me. I'd really like to see that part of it. Man, it's an incredible tragedy all around.
Yeah.
You know, regardless of, you know, I've seen a little bit of the, you know, the person who was shot, you know, he was not a nice person. I've seen a little bit of that. We have to always remember that today's victim is tomorrow's offender, and today's offender is tomorrow's victim. It's just kind of how that works, you know, in the world of police work, police interactions, you know. And you have to keep that in mind when you're dealing with somebody. Like, just because yesterday this guy was a horrible human being does not mean that today he doesn't deserve as much professionalism as I can muster to handle his victim status, you know? So going into that, I don't think the officer, you know, I would hope she did not go in there biased. I don't think they proved that. I think they might have wanted to prove that she had some sort of bias that caused her to have intent, but I don't think they proved that. And I think that
if you didn't
really
have intent, but there's other situations I can think of. I could think of a couple ones, like the one where I can't remember his name right now, but where they pulled up on the guy who was selling like bootleg cassettes or whatever, and then he had a weapon and they shot him. But the officers rolling up on the scene get a description of this guy, and they get some of his prior arrests, and you find out that this is a guy who's resisted arrest half a dozen times, and he's been caught with firearms, and is wanted for attempted murder or something like that. Wouldn't that have to impact how you approach this person and
yeah,
the level of stress you're going to feel at that moment?
It should. Yeah, it definitely is going to impact you. They have radio codes or signals or whatever where they'll let you know this person's on parole, or this person has weapon offenses, or has warrants at the moment, or is known to have weapons on them. And there's criteria they have to meet in order to have that put on them. So if you do get that warning, it's not just, you know, somebody heard somebody say this
Right.
one time that the guy might have had a knife, you know. It's like, no, this dude is a frequent flyer, consistently uses weapons, consistently caught with weapons, has weapons offenses, you know, and that kind of thing, like convictions. So that will amp you up a little bit,
Sure.
you know. I know in training and as a trainer, we constantly stress that there's no routine calls. There's nothing is, treat everything the same. Put yourself in a tactical advantage where you don't have to be reactive and respond. You're not behind the curve and all that stuff. But that it would be disingenuous to say that hearing that code come over attached to someone's name, like, hey, I'm going to be out with so-and-so, you're on a, in our town, we had multiple channels. So you didn't tie up one channel. So you switch over to an alternate channel, and your partner switches over to an alternate channel, and they're running this person's name. And then it comes back with a warning, like a gang hit or a weapons hit or something like that. It would be disingenuous to say that, no, man, we're so tactically tuned in that hearing that didn't amp me a little bit, like, yeah, it's like, okay, wait, are we in the best position we can be in? Are we handling this guy the best possible way to handle him to negate anything? Like, I want him to look at both of us or look at me by myself or whomever and be like, not today.
Right.
Not this guy. This guy's too squared away.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I think receiving that over the radio will amp people up and take them up. I still don't know that I just don't know that they proved that anything there.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Created intent on her part. And that's going to be interesting in the appeals process when it comes out, just to see, like, what will that look like?
Right.
Will they argue? They're going to have to argue that. That's the whole appeal right there.
100%.
The entire appeal is intent.
Yeah.
Or I mean, it's going to be based on, that they sentenced her manslaughter, but without proven intent.
Right.
Well,
you know what? We've been talking for 2 hours.
Holy cow.
So
it just flies with you, man. Time just flies.
I know. That was great. I really enjoyed it. But this is gonna be their first podcast for the year. Your product comes out in 5 days from now, so people can look forward to that. And I want to thank you for starting off the new year with me.
Yeah, thank you, man, for having me. It was awesome.
Right on. I'll see you soon.
All right, man. See you.